So if I can just introduce Dr. Roger S. Pulwarty, who is a senior scientist at NOAA in the United States of America. NOAA, of course, stands for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Roger has been a lead author, co-author of far too many IPCC publications. I think they become grimmer and grimmer. But Roger, you are joining us as an expert and will be speaking to the risk knowledge and governance reforms required to contend with 21st century risks, the learning by doing side of things. So over to you, please. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to ask Jamie to move the slides ahead for me since I'm having some screen issues, but let's get moving so we can have a discussion on some of this. So as we talked about many of the themes that you're hearing, one of the things that we would like to make sure that we're paying attention to is exactly the questions you had. This is going to tie a lot of threads together. How do we know risk? What is it? What did we learn from the GAR? Yes, we have heard all of these, we need nature-based solutions, we need aligned financing. What's stopping us? So let's think through the complexity of some of these issues. And if you click, the slide says change is ahead, but change is ahead with a lot of things that are submerged below that glacier that are unknown, uncharacterized, low probability events. And we make a mistake if we think and pretend that we know the future too clearly. So we get back to the initial talk by Genti in which we begin to think about the space in which we're going to act. Next slide, please. As we think through this, there have been, we have many. Now this figure is taken from the IPCC Special Report on Extremes, which we worked on almost 10 years ago. This is the second slide. I'm hoping we're on that. In which we actually have simple risk, complicated risk, and complex and compounding risk. We need to deal with all of those. And yet, what we know is that cascading and compounding risk, local imbalances are disrupting what we have come to know as traditional risk management. Now, this is extremely important. When I work with Native American communities in the US, one of the first things they remind me of is uncertainty might not be what you do not know. It's what you have come to know that is no longer so. So this becomes a very big challenge for us to think about whether or not we're applying the right tools when we keep recommending the same things as response, and we're all guilty of this. So the next slide gives us a sense of the globally networked risks that we're dealing with that Shoaib and others talked about. There's the trade of corn, wheat, soybean complex. Modern food systems are highly dependent on this. And we know from the 2010 drought in the Ukraine and Russia that the very places that are being impacted right now because of a lack of imports of wheat and fertilizer are the ones that were impacted during that drought event. So the globally interconnected world that Shoaib talked about, the fact that proximate connections are not always the most direct. In fact, our trade, we have a drought right now in the lower Mississippi Basin in the United States that is restricting the movement of grain and food to other parts of the world. And from the GAR report, we have to think in terms, next slide, these global trade regimes, efficiency, peacetime, all ask for a stable environment. And I'm trying to make sure we're on the same slide because I see it move. And in that setting, the large figure that you're seeing shows this cascading issue of from the 2019 GAR report, and when things happen in different parts of the world, how they cascade through these linkages of or wireless systems or security systems or trade, all the way down to sometimes ending in political destabilization and sometimes even food riots and conflict. They don't drive the process, they don't drive those, but they certainly exacerbate them. That's one type of systemic risk. Another kind is, if we go to the next slide, please. It happened in the 2017 season, one of the most active seasons in the Caribbean. I'm from the Caribbean, from Trinidad, and there were 22 of 29 Caribbean island states were impacted, 4 by one storm. But when we ask, how did a place like Puerto Rico get actually impacted? And if you put the slide up, it took 120 days or more to recover water, cell coverage, electricity. And the most important thing was the critical system failures caused evacuations, closures, and extensive reduction in services long after the event. This has become very critical for when we think about resilient infrastructure in the terms of networks. Now, this also happened on the heels of the worst drought in 50 years in the Caribbean. So the complexity is the linkage between the drought, the hurricanes, and then the cascading impacts through water, cell coverage, electricity, and access to medical care. So there are two types of systemic risk, the globally networked ones and the ones that are vertical and subnational, that links insecurity to produce risks that we don't recover from. And we saw the impacts of that when Hurricane Fiona hit Puerto Rico this year. In fact, they had not actually fully recovered. So where are we when we think about the information, the knowledge that's needed? This is a report done by the WMO on climate indicators and sustainable development. And the idea is, what is an indicator if it's not a sense of early warning? If it's not a sense of, as the Secretary General said, an effort to ensure that citizens worldwide are protected by early warning systems within 5 years. At the same time, the Secretary General recognizes that you have to invest equally in adaptation and resilience, or the ability to act on early warning isn't there. So this is a really profound statement, getting us to linking the issue of early warning systems in the near term with long-term risk and resilience. Next slide. So here's the example of how we structure a multi-hazard early warning system. And the idea, click please, is to link the multiple sectors of government, local, national, transportation, feedback for the system improvement to help us understand the multiple aspects of risk. This figure comes from the WMO in partnership with how we're developing the information systems. I co-chair the climate information system for the WMO, but this does not happen with active engagement at the subnational level on the issue of disaster risk reduction. And so if we go to the next slide, here's one example with colleagues of mine in the Caribbean. There's hydrometeorological hazards, climate, geological, and marine. Multi-hazard early warning systems are able to address these hazards. They may occur alone, but when they occur simultaneously, this actually shows and explicates the value. Now we have to remember, as I mentioned, I'm from the Caribbean. No two islands are the same. And the Caribbean islands are themselves dynamic and multifaceted environments. So on the one hand, we have the multiple hazards, and on the other hand, we have very diverse environments. So the next slide. So if you just stay there for a sec. In one case, there's a tropical depression Grace, which came right after an earthquake in Haiti. Because of the working of this multi-hazard early warning system in the region, disaster risk professionals, the government of Haiti, the government of the Caribbean were actually in place to help respond to that event after you had an earthquake and then a tropical storm. If we look at the next figure, click please, you see the eruption of Soufriere, the previous one, thanks. We see the eruption of Soufriere from St. Vincent, and the impact it had was actually on reduction of photovoltaic production in Barbados. When you see the spread of that, you're actually looking as how a hazard, even within a region, then begins to impact other locations. And we see the same thing from the standpoint of migration and so on. So click, please. The thing that worked here was the regional consortium. All right, just go back up to 8, please. Is the regional consortium of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Authority, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, working with the food security folks, working with the health folks, that actually was brought to bear. So not hazard by hazard, but a territorial information system coordinated by multiple entities within a region. So yes, hazard by hazard, subnational in action. So the point of this is to actually show, and if we take the next slide, that countries have the subnational responsibilities, and then even the national decisions are then affected by what happens not only internationally, but even within the region that they are. And in one example, one excellent example in which we're engaged, after the 2017 hurricane, the island of Dominica decided they're going to be climate proof. And what this led to was the creation of an entire effort, click please, to make a climate resilient Dominica. Okay, go back up, thanks. A climate resilient Dominica. And this is the first effort globally in which the subnational entities are working together on linking community emergency readiness, innovative approaches to insurance, and looking at creating the island as an adaptive system. This is quite a unique setting. So I wanted to make sure that we were having those two sort of, yes, they're globally networked risks, yes, they're local imbalances, but it's only an effort such as the one here on the critical initiatives in Dominica that gets us at how do we link those time and place scales together. So if we go to the next slide, thanks, we see the Sendai Framework. And if we click, we know the links. This is from the NAPA programs. We know the links to the 2030 Agenda for SDGs and the links to the Paris Agreement. But what we take from the Secretary General's comments is actually that, click through this, please. Several targets of the SDGs are reliant on DRR. We know that climate change and SDGs are linked, but we're making the case, click, that recognizing disaster risk reduction is a necessary precondition for both the SDGs and adaptation. It's not an add-on. It is, in fact, the thing that shapes whether or not we're successful in climate change adaptation. And so it's a slightly different way of asking the question, does adapting to climate change need to incorporate disaster risk management? It's actually the other question is, climate change adaptation does not work if it is not incorporating disaster risk management. And that is a different framing. So the next slide, where are we in thinking about this? In a changing world and the uncertainties in the changing world, we have to not ask how do we navigate for change, but how do we navigate through changes of these timescales and these active efforts. And as Schwab and others mentioned, it becomes a cumulative process across these scales. So if you click, here's one version done by Bapon Fakhruddin of the graph cube that tells us as we think about cross time scales and space scales, the link is global, national, regional, and local, and then subnational at the NGOs, private sectors, and so on. But what does that mean? We recognize these. We don't, it's very difficult to act across time scales. I'm not making, just tossing this out there and saying we need to act together. What has stopped us from doing it? And so if we go to the next slide and just click through the slide, please. And we think in terms of governance, we have to advance the governance of risk knowledge and broaden that actor network. Not just who is affected, but where do their loans come from? Where do their rebuilding? We worked for years on the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. How do the development planners, financial institutions help ensure political authority and coherence, the role of the parliamentarians, develop a culture of partnerships, decentralize step by step, but to realize this is not a simple notion of co-production. This is much beyond co-production. This is how we shape our futures together, how we produce the future. Efficiency is most critical at the local level, but accountability and financing has to be aligned across all of these scales. So one of the things that we see as a gap that needs effort is in the Caribbean region, we developed and supported a cadre of professionals, vibrant students to work on, click here please. Right, and click through this, to assess the climate risks, to address user needs, advance nature and equity-based solutions. But more important than all of those was to sustain the policy and transdisciplinary networks. We make these recommendations and sometimes we're then grasping for who is to do it. And the issue here is to develop that cadre and critical mass. And if we go to the next slide, one of my second to last slide, is moving from pledges to implementation. And we hear this a lot. And one of the best roles for public-private interfaces and civil society is to create a marketplace for resilience. How upfront investment buys us down risk, but also provides that triple dividend. But the only way that happens is to finance systems that are adaptive, not just adaptation pilots. And if you click one more time, that figure comes from a report we did on risk layering and financing for the UNCCD. It's to support the establishment of regional and national coordination mechanism for aligning financing along the areas I just mentioned, vertically and horizontally. So the last slide basically says, yes, we have a lot of theories of change. We need a practice of change. So thank you very much. I couldn't see the slide, so I hope that went.
Yes.
That yes. Co-evolved together. Yes.
Indeed. I don't think too much was lost in translation, Roger. Although I have to say that those slides were they're just so so dense. They had many levels, and we weren't able to do all the transitions that were in your original slides.
Yeah.
But we will be sharing the PowerPoint as a PDF.
Yeah,
and
no,
it will
thanks.
be provided
The
as a
idea of
resource.
putting them is so that people could have them. You know, so
Indeed,
they're not trying to remember what was said. Yes.
Yeah, so that will be a resource which will also be uploaded